Hey everybody, welcome back to Tim Travels. It's Terry, your host. So I'm coming to you from New Jersey, although I just got back from being across the river and hanging out with family in the Philadelphia area. The load I was going to pick up today was canceled, so I got another load out of Laurel, Maryland, dryers that I need to pick up at 0600, so I won't get down to North Carolina to pick up my TNT trainee until Monday, and that's a 9 a.m. appointment, so we'll see. We'll see when he actually gets on the truck. But I did want to talk about some history and some interesting developments in the world of our government that are probably going to impact a lot of us over the next little bit. And the history I wanted to talk about is, of course, today is 9/11/2021, so it's 20 years since the World Trade Center attacks and the attacks on the Pentagon, and also the flight that ended up crashing, Flight 93, that ended up crashing into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And a lot of us, I'm sure, can remember exactly where we were when we found out. It just so happened that I had just retired from the Navy, and I was in my third year of law school, and I had an early morning class on Tuesday mornings. Actually, I think it was Tuesday and Thursday mornings. I had this early morning class, and it was unusual because most of the times, college classes don't start, early, but this, I think, was like an 8:15 or maybe 8:30 start. It was the earliest class in the entire law school, and the reason it was that time of the day is because, and it was commercial law, and which is an important subject for lawyers. It's on the bar exam, so it was, and it was a year-long class. It was a 6 credit, and but the teacher, the professor, was actually a sitting federal judge who happened to be the chief judge of the U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland. His name is Fred Smolkin. Very, 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 very bright guy. And we're in class, and Judge Smolkin gets a phone call in the middle of class, and that was like highly unusual that he would get a phone call in class on his cell phone, because that's kind of like breach of decorum at law school. Like you definitely don't want to get a cell phone call while you're in court, and obviously he's a federal judge. He would know that. That would be like this big breach of decorum. But what was even stranger to me, and I picked up on it right away, is that he took the call. Like, he's in the middle of a lecture, he gets a call on his cell phone, which was highly unusual, but then he takes the call. And not only did he take the call, but he was like, I could tell that it was something very serious. And I knew that probably only one of two people, or maybe, 2 categories of people, would call him where he would take the call. One would be his law clerk, who would only ever call in a dire emergency, like something incredibly serious, or a family member, close family member, who would know never to call him at that time in the morning because he would be in class, like his wife or somebody, or maybe one of his children. And so he takes the call, and he comes back in, and he says, a plane just hit the World Trade Center in New York. And immediately, because I still lived on a military installation. Like, even though I was technically, I had transferred to Fleet Reserve, I still lived on the naval station in Annapolis, Maryland. And so immediately I was like, that's not a coincidence. In my mind, I'm like, that's not a coincidence. That's not an accident. And the reason I said that is because the weather was so perfect. Like I was in downtown Baltimore, where the University of Maryland School of Law is, and East Baltimore, but you know, it's still right in the core of the city. It's just up the street from Camden Yards, if you know where the Ravens and the Orioles play. And you know, so I was like, that's not an accident. The weather was perfect. And of course, by the time we get out of class, my wife gets a hold of me, and you know, we, like I said, we still lived on base, and she was immediately telling me about the Pentagon, and I was like, oh, well, you know, this is obviously this big terrorist attack, right? And so, you know, the whole place is crazy. We're in this big city. There's lots of tall buildings in Baltimore, not like New York, obviously, but you know, it's a big city. And Washington has been attacked, or at least the Pentagon. And you know, I finally am able to get out of Baltimore and get back to Annapolis, and I get back to a place where I live that is now turned into like this armed compound. In fact, the base was so clamped down that people that my wife did daycare for, who were military related, like maybe a reservist, or like she watched kids whose mom was a teacher and whose dad was a police officer for the Anne Arundel County Police Department, but the reason he could use Navy daycare was he was a Coast Guard reservist at the time. He could not even get on the base. His wife could not get on the base to get their kids, so my wife had to deliver the kids later on that day. So that's just my recollection. But I want to talk about history and about dates. You know, people talk about, hey, you know, you hear this, never forget. But I think what we forget is, we forget a lot of stuff. Ask the average American what the significance of December 7th, 1941 was. A lot of people won't be able to tell you. November 22nd, 1963. A lot of people will not be able to tell you unless they've heard the news. But if it's not around that time of the year, where somebody's mentioned it on the TV or an article shown up, they're not going to remember. So there are a couple dates that I want you to remember that are related to 9/11, but that never really got into the consciousness of the rank and file average American, because they didn't think it impacted them and they didn't understand the import of these events. The first date is August 7th, 1998. And you may say, well, Terry, what happened on August 7th, 1998? Well, lots of stuff happened, but the two most significant events, at least to anybody that's from the United States, is our embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania were bombed simultaneously. And that was an attack carried out by elements that were basically part of Al-Qaeda. That was in 1998, the summer of 98. And they were targeted, simultaneous attacks that killed hundreds of people. But there weren't a lot of Americans killed. Like, most of the casualties were foreign nationals, citizens of the countries, workers at our embassies. Because you may not know this, but U.S. embassies, even in countries that are very adversarial to us, we always employ dozens or hundreds of locals. Like in Moscow, even during the Cold War, we employed hundreds of Russians. Now, a lot of them were spies, like probably, 75-80% were actually spies, and we knew it, but we still employed people in the local populace, and that's very common, very common. And just like, if you were to live in Washington, D.C., you might work at the French embassy. You're an American, but you work at the French embassy. You work at you work at the Ghanaian embassy or whatever. So anyway, the United States always hires locals. And they bore the brunt of these truck bombings at our embassies. And so August 7th, 1998 was really kind of, and there's stuff that goes back even farther that involves Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah or other terrorist organizations targeting United States personnel and assets abroad. But and shortly after, like August 20th of 98, President Clinton orders a significant Tomahawk strike on targets in Afghanistan. Now, again, you know, it wasn't a big thing to somebody that, you know, it's like it's a world away. Like if I said to the average American, find Dar es Salaam, Tanzania on a map, they're not going to be able to, you know, unless the map's labeled and they look for a while. Same with Nairobi, Kenya. They're not going to find it, right? And that was just a world away. Well, then fast forward a couple of years to October 10th, 2000. October 10th, 2000. The USS Cole is pulled into port in Aden, Yemen. Now, that was not a port we normally pulled into, but we were trying to show the flag, project power, right? That's one of the things that the Navy does. And also, you know, kind of throw a bone to the Yemenis by using their port services. The Cole is bombed. Several U.S. sailors are killed, like about 18 guys, another 37 injured. That was very personal to me for a lot of reasons. One is I knew people on that ship at the time of the bombing. I also had midshipmen, because I was at the Naval Academy at the time. I also had midshipmen who had just come from the Cole to then be midshipmen. They had been previous enlisted guys who qualified for, you know, entry into the academy, and had just come from there. So they were very much impacted. And I got to tell you that you know, on a personal level, you know, I knew stuff about that bombing and what the crew had to go through to save that ship that was never really in the public domain. I mean, in Navy circles, you know, some of the stuff I read at the time was classified, but it was really, it really had a huge impact on me because it was very emotional. And so these events, though, were precursors to what happened on 9/11. And the last event that was a harbinger of what was about to happen was there was in Afghanistan, there were people that were friendly to the U.S. called the Northern Alliance, and they were in the north part of Afghanistan. And just a few days before 9/11, some of their leadership was assassinated by Al-Qaeda or Taliban, but I think Al-Qaeda operatives posing as journalists who were supposedly going to interview them. And that, again, you know, it was something that was so like random and far away that the vast majority of Americans didn't understand the import of it, or maybe even knew about it. But that was a precursor, because you remember right after 9/11, right, we sent CIA, you know, operatives go in there from clandestine services, U.S. Special Forces go in there, SEALs, Green Berets, you know, we send in, you know, a lot of forces, and then obviously there becomes a military buildup. But within a day or two, we had forces on the ground there. But the people we made contact with first were people from the Northern Alliance who were enemies of the Taliban, right? So they were allies of ours. Killing their leadership was part of an overall strategy that led up to 9/11, okay? And so, you know, 9/11 happens, and, you know, then all of a sudden, people are interested in everything, right? We become this country that creates, you know, a lot of really restrictive laws that arguably violate people's civil rights. We create new enormous federal agencies and more bureaucracy, right? That turns out to be really kind of ineffective, in that it really didn't change how we moved forward. And so we find ourselves 20 years later, and a lot of stuff has happened in the last 20 years. We've spent hundreds of billions of dollars for stuff that we have nothing to show for. Like the entire war in Iraq, we got nothing to show for it. And if you're the person who says, well, we got rid of Saddam Hussein, you probably don't understand what Saddam Hussein was, what the Baathists were in Iraq, and how their presence actually was beneficial to the United States. And I don't have time to get into the entire Iran-Iraq war and our presence in the Gulf, but there's three books I want to recommend. And if you've never read these books and you actually want to understand the truth about why things happened and how we got where we are, I want to recommend a book that talks about everything leading up to 9/11. In fact, the last day in the book that's discussed is September 10th, 2001. And then I want to recommend a book that talks about the day of the attack and what happened in the Twin Towers. But it also it talks a lot about people and about heroes, unsung heroes. And it will debunk some of the mythic stuff that's out there about the FDNY and why the FDNY lost 343 members in this attack. And it will talk about, just weird stuff that made that attack so spectacular and so successful for Al-Qaeda that Al-Qaeda could have never in a million years dreamed of. Like, we as as institutions in our own country, we made ourselves more vulnerable. And why is this important now? Because we made the mistakes then, and there's really not a lot of evidence that we've ever corrected those mistakes. And then the last book I'm going to recommend, and all of these I'm going to put in the comments section, but the last book I'm going to recommend is about stuff that came afterwards. So the first book is called The Looming Tower, and it was written by a guy named Wright, and I think it was made into a movie, but you really got to read the book. You got to go back and understand the Muslim Brotherhood and a guy named Muhammad Qutb, who was an Egyptian, and it will walk you through how we got to the point of 9/11 with radical terrorists, Muslim terrorists, from certain parts of the world, like from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, stuff like that. It is not an indictment of Islam, and it shouldn't be, but it's a terribly important book. The second book about the day of 9/11 in the towers is a book called 102 Minutes, 102 Minutes. And it was written by a New York Times reporter who's since passed away named Jim Dwyer. I've read that book more than once because, first of all, it's very compelling. It's about everyday people doing mundane, everyday jobs. But it's a lot about building construction, building codes, disregard for our shortcomings of emergency service providers. But it's also about people who made decisions during a crisis that either saved their lives or cost them their lives. And it's an important book for anybody to read because it teaches about instinct and that almost sixth sense, right? Like that tiny voice in your head that tells you, get out of here. And when people believe authority at the wrong time, right? When people are like, when they're like, no, there's no need to evacuate, but your gut is like, I got to get out of here, right? And sometimes people don't want to be a chicken, right? But they really did need to leave. And it's a great book. It's a great book. And the 102 minutes, what does that refer to? From the moment that the North Tower, Tower number 1, was struck, till the moment that the North Tower fell, 102 minutes later. Because keep in mind, the North Tower struck first, South Tower's then struck, and that's the really famous one where it's basically on live TV. South Tower's hit, it's hit lower and at a different angle. It falls before the North Tower does, then the North Tower falls. That all took 102 minutes. And again, it's a great book by a great author who was, and there's a lot of great research, and it will, and a lot of what's in there will bother you. Even 20 years later, it will bother you. The lack of understanding of, like, the FDNY about what could happen and what did happen. You know, guys went into burning buildings and didn't come out, but a lot of it wasn't because of, you know, a lot of it was just because of ignorance. And it was a failure of leadership. It was a failure of imagination. And one of the lines in the book, Dwyer says, this attack succeeded way more than Al-Qaeda should ever be given credit for. And it was because of decisions we made in the 1960s about building construction and stuff. So that's the second book. And then the third book is a book called March Toward Hell, or The March Toward Hell. And it was written by a guy named Michael Scheuer, who is an author. He has podcasts. But his claim to fame, and the reason his opinion really matters, is because he was the guy that ran the Bin Laden unit at the CIA. He was a CIA analyst. And The March Toward Hell talks about why the war in Iraq was a mistake, why Saddam Hussein was actually a stabilizing force in the Middle East, why it was that Al-Qaeda even wanted to attack us. You know, those are just 3 books that will help your understanding of what happened, help your understanding of the history. Another book that I would recommend, and it's on the professional reading list, you know, when I was in the military, and it still applies today, is From Beirut to Jerusalem. Or is it From Jerusalem to From Beirut to Jerusalem, by Thomas Friedman. And in particular, there's a chapter in there called Hama Rules, H-A-M-A, Rules. And it talks about Hama, Syria, when Bashir al-Assad, who's the dictator who runs Syria, when his father, Hafez al-Assad, was the president of Syria, how he crushed a rebellion in the city of Hama. And, you know, oftentimes I would hear people talk about, oh, let's turn this country into a parking lot. Well, guess what? Hafez Assad actually did turn this city into a parking lot. Like, he basically gave them, you know, a few days for the bad people to surrender, and of course they would have been executed. And when they didn't, he just had the city surrounded and shelled repeatedly until the city was basically a pile of rubble. And then he had it bulldozed into something flat. Like, no bodies were recovered, no fires were put out. They just literally wiped the place off the map. And you say, well, how could this guy do that? Those were his countrymen. And the reason that chapter is so important is because it makes you understand what role tribalism plays in the Middle East, even to this day. And so when you hear people say stuff like, oh, Saddam Hussein gassed his own people, you realize that that's not a true statement. He didn't gas his own people. He gassed people that lived in the political borders of his country, but they're not his tribe. And when you understand stuff like that, you then understand why Saddam Hussein would do that, why saying those are his people is not true. And if you think about the tribalism, think about what happened to Sikhs after 9/11, or people that looked Arab, people that were Indian or, you know, Pakistani or whatever, right? There was tribalism here, right? You had gun-toting people that wanted to like be patriots, killing Americans who ran gas stations and who were just out minding their own business, who were not any threat to the United States and were U.S. citizens and just living the American dream. Tribalism is a big deal, and it rears its ugly head here all the time. So anyway, that's today's history lesson, kinda. And I hope you'll look at some of those books. So real quick, I don't want to take up any more time, much more time, but real quick, vaccine mandate. The Biden administration has decided that they can't convince enough people to get the vaccine. COVID is hurting our economy. It's hurting millions of businesses, certainly, but it's hurting millions and millions of people too, obviously. And there's going to be a big court fight and stuff like that. But I talk about the law sometimes, and here's the thing, right? You know, Biden didn't say, you know, bring it on when people said, oh, we're going to challenge these mandates. OSHA can do a lot. OSHA has a lot of power. And what Biden's doing is, regardless of what you think about the vaccine, it's a shrewd move for this reason. It takes a lot of pressure off corporate leadership, right? Corporations now, so let's say that you work at Tyson, right? And we all know Tyson is mandating vaccines. What if Tyson mandates vaccines, but say ConAgra doesn't, or some other meat packer or food producer doesn't? Tyson will not have to worry about losing workers to a competitor, because the competitor is going to have to vaccinate people. Now, the interesting thing is, at a company like Prime, there are so many of us who are independent contractors who will not fall under that mandate. But everybody that works at a terminal, all the mechanics, fleet managers, payroll, anybody that works in those buildings is going to fall under that. Also, all the company drivers are going to fall under that mandate. But those of us who are independent contractors won't. However, it wouldn't surprise me that at some point, notwithstanding what Steve Field said about, oh, well, Tyson's going to take whoever we send, you know, Tyson's a huge customer of our company. And you know how you can tell a huge customer of any trucking company? Go by one of their facilities and see how many trailers are in their parking lot. Well, I haven't been to a ton of Tyson facilities, but every one I've been to had a bunch of Prime trailers. So I know they're a huge customer. And, you know, if other employers like Walmart follow suit, it may be that people, drivers who haven't been vaccinated, might not get some loads. I don't think that's going to be, you know, like the norm, because I do think that even if you're unvaccinated, you go to a shipper receiver, you know, they got the glass up, they make you wear a mask. There's a very little interaction. That's what I think. But I don't know. There might be some shippers or receivers or customers that are like, no, we got the power to do this now, and that's what we're going to do, because the government has given us carte blanche on this issue. I think, you know, Biden is taking a lot of pressure off businesses. And I think if you look at the markets, the Dow, the NASDAQ, the S&P 500, they're going to react well to this, actually. I think that it's going to be viewed positively, in that it's going to get us on track. And so, you know, I'm happy to hear everybody's opinion about vaccines, but I really do think that it's people should have seen this coming. You know, Los Angeles Unified School District has now mandated vaccinations for every eligible kid 12 and over. There's already a lot of mandates in place. We just, you know, if they don't impact you, you might not know about them. But this was in the tea leaves, and it has been so for a while. So anyway, have a good day. I'll get back with you. We got a lot of stuff to talk about over the next little bit. And by the way, I heard somebody shooting off fireworks tonight. This is not a day for fireworks. And if you thought it was, then you're wrong. You're wrong. Fireworks are for celebrations, not for days where the United States got, you know, its ass kicked and we lost thousands of people and lots of people have trauma still. It's not a day for celebration. So if you shot off fireworks today, shame on you, and do better next time. So please be safe. I'll talk to all of you soon. Bye.